Okay, everyone. Thank you very much for being here on this episode of the MirYam Institute webinar. We greatly appreciate having your time and your attention. We're here for a situational update, and I will talk you through what we're going to discuss in due course. But first, I'd like to begin, as ever I do, by thanking my co-founder at the MirYam Institute, Rosita Panini. Thank you, Rosita, for all you do. And I'd like to thank our colleague in common, Mr. Alan Langer. Alan, thank you very much indeed for what you do to bring these events about. And I'd also like to thank all of those who are listening. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving your time and your attention to a subject that warrants that attention. We greatly, greatly appreciate it. I'm your host for today, Benjamin Anthony, as I mentioned, co-founder of the MirYam Institute. And we are joined by an esteemed interviewee, a colleague and a friend. His name is Yaakov Lappin, and Yaakov is an Israel-based military affairs correspondent and analyst. He provides insight and analysis for a number of media outlets, including Jane's Defense Weekly, a leading global military affairs magazine, and JNS.org, a news agency with wide distribution among Jewish communities in the United States. In the past, Yaakov worked as the defense correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. He's also a research associate at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and a frequent guest commentator on international television news networks, including Sky News and I-24. He's the author of Virtual Caliphate, Exposing the Islamic State on the Internet, actually the Islamist state on the Internet. Yaakov holds a BA in Politics and Modern History from the University of Manchester. He and I met during his time studying there. We both enrolled in the same year and were campaigners on the University Union steps during the events of the Second Intifada. And Yaakov also earned his master's degree in the history of international relations from the London School of Economics. Yaakov, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you so very much for being with us. I greatly appreciate it as ever. Let me just begin by asking you how you're doing.
It's great to be here, Benjamin. Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing well. Can't really complain. I think, I'm happy to be on the show, to be working with you, and to be covering some of the most interesting events that I believe are happening in the world, from a real front seat position.
Well, it's great to have you with us, Yaakov, and I know that you're intimately involved in all of the work that we do, and we greatly, greatly appreciate your insights as our in-house analysts. So we're going to get right to it. We'll run for about 45 minutes to an hour today, Yaakov. As you may be able to discern, I'm dialing in from my hotel room here in the United States of America. Forgive the background. I hope it doesn't offend you in any way, but there was no office space available. So let's start off. I wanted to talk about Gaza, Iran, domestic politics, and the elections. I'm going to rejuggle that order a little bit because, of course, today comes the news that yet another member of the governing coalition has departed from that coalition, rendering the governing coalition of the State of Israel in the minority. Now, Rinawi Zoabi of Meretz, which is a party to the left of center, I would say the far left of center, you can feel free to correct me if you disagree, he has quit the coalition. Now, this is a very stark contrast with the last defector, Edith Silman from the political right, who also bolted the coalition, was actually the whip for the coalition. She has bolted. So people are being picked off or are leaving from the left and from the right. And what is left is no longer a majority and also no longer equal to the size of the opposition. Yaakov, why is the coalition losing members from the left and from the right? And let's be frank about it. It's finished, isn't it?
Well, I think that before we decide, that it's finally knocked out, there's a technical point that we should make. And then I think there's a larger conceptual point. Technically speaking, this government is not yet finished. It may well be on the way to being finished, but The Meretz party is now in intensive efforts. It's in an emergency mode to try and convince Zouabi to resign from the Knesset, or either to resign to her decision and come back to the coalition, or to quit the Knesset. If she quits the Knesset, then they can replace her with a substitute Knesset member, and this government could live to see another day. If, however, she refuses to quit the Knesset and she begins voting against the government, then we will talk about elections potentially in September, and those would of course be very early elections, and that would be the demise of this government. We're not there yet in terms of final confirmation, and the coming days will really decide, and it all hinges on Meretz's ability to either get Zouabi to quit the Knesset or not. So that's a technical note. I think conceptually, this government, and I view it as an experiment. It was really an experiment about whether Israel could overcome identity politics. And it has taken two real body blows, which could end up being mortal blows. First of all, with the resignation of Idit Silman, who was the chairwoman of the Yamina party and of the coalition. And the fact that she quit by citing offense against her community, against her national religious community, showed that she was unable to overcome this tension that she felt between loyalty to her identity, her community, and the wider national government. And Zouabi actually gave very similar reasons when she quit. And it almost doesn't matter whether one of those communities is going to the right, and one of those communities is talking about Arab-Israeli interests. In both cases, the defectors and the quitters said, "I can no longer contain this tension between the national interest and my identity politics." So it is a blow to this concept, to this experiment, that Israel can overcome identity politics and build a unity government that looks after the national interest. Is it a deadly blow? We'll find out soon enough.
So since 2014, Yaakov, just so that everybody knows my place here in this conversation, since 2014, specifically Operation Protective Edge, I have protest voted against the then incumbent Prime Minister Netanyahu, but I have done so to the right of him. I've repeatedly voted for Naftali Bennett, not because I thought that Naftali Bennett would be Prime Minister. I decidedly did not think that, but I wanted somebody to the right of Benjamin Netanyahu there in the coalition. I thought that it was very, very important that they be there and present and be outspoken. Now, I mention that because I want everybody to understand the notion I'm going to ask you about is not one that resonates with me and brings me joy. But I do have to ask you, does this mean that Bibi will be back? I do not want to see the return of Prime Minister Netanyahu for what my view is worth. I do not think that he brings any new ideas. I do not think that he resolved any of the issues that he said that he would resolve: Iran, Lebanon, what was taking place in the Gaza Strip. I do not think that he deserves the moniker of being Mr. Security. I think that many of his security policies, if not were outright failures, certainly fell short of what he told the electorate he would bring to Israeli life in successive cycles of elections. But he is there. He can't, I don't think, bring about a majority by way of the defection of the Meretz member of the government. But he's only one away, could be done. Are we going to see Netanyahu back on the throne?
So I think that, if we don't go to elections, but this government does fall, there's a chance of him coming back in the sense that the remaining members of the coalition, the Zionist parties, could decide out of pure desperation and desire to avoid another round of elections, which could lead to more stalemate, to form a new unity government with Netanyahu. It's certainly a possibility. It may seem unthinkable now, but as you said very correctly, this government is hanging on by a thread. So if it's unable to fix this damage, if it's unable to at least get back to a point where it's 60-60 with the opposition, then yes, we could end up in a scenario where, Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid turn to Netanyahu and say, listen, let's form a new unity government. You will be probably second in rotation and not first. And that is something that we have to think about as a possibility that is not, in the realm of science fiction. It's absolutely possible. It cannot be ruled out.
But what about the straightforward possibility as well that elections are called and Bibi manages to cobble together a majority? How realistic do you think that is?
You see, when it comes to elections, I think that, we have seen this attempt to go and resolve this political stalemate that the country has been in fail time and time again. And it is a real crisis. We had years of no budget being passed. We had years of temporary governments because elections failed to provide decisive outcomes. And personally, I don't see any reason why the next election should prove any different. The country is split down the middle. There are clear political blocks, and my worry is really the seeping in of identity politics. I think identity politics is a poison for this country. It's something that Israel cannot afford to get bogged down with because the national interest is so much more important, so much more critical. And therefore, I don't see elections as a solution to anything. Either way, the bloc, whatever bloc may gain a majority in the next elections, it would likely be a very narrow victory, if at all, right? And then that would leave its political legitimacy always hanging by a thread, always easily toppled. So I think that, the political system is not able to deliver right now a resolution to this endless political instability and the inability of the nation really to decide where it wants to go in terms of its future political direction. It's a real crisis.
There is a real need, Yaakov, for a total overhaul of the political system. For years, for decades, we've celebrated always the fact that Israel is not only a democracy, but it's a rambunctious democracy. But the system's now showing itself to be, if not broken, very much strained. It's not an efficient way of bringing about a stable government. It doesn't seem to be working because I would just say the identity politics of which you speak, those are not seeping into the body politic. They are there. They are being pumped around the internal vascular respiratory system of the body politic. And until that goes, you're going to have this continuing instability. And nobody seems to have interest or, frankly, the political clout to bring about the overhaul of the system that is so required. Do you agree or disagree?
I would agree that nobody has the ability because when this coalition came into power, they talked about things like setting term limits. And that was an initial goal that Justice Minister Sal set for this coalition. It's a goal that he acknowledged recently that was failed, and he called it a huge missed opportunity. In terms of restructuring, the system in order to raise the threshold and make it more difficult for smaller parties to actually get into the Knesset, that would go a long way towards stabilizing the system because whenever you're in a situation where any small party or even a member of a party can bring down an entire coalition, that is basically a situation that is begging for identity politics to come in and cause havoc to the system. So raising the threshold would be one of the obvious countermeasures, and nobody's able to do it. Everybody talks about it, and it has not happened. So I agree that nobody has the ability. I would say, though, that in terms of intent, I think that this government, this coalition, is an attempt to overcome this quagmire. It is an attempt. It's the first time I can ever recall that a government in Israel has Jews and Arabs in it, right and left and center, national, religious, and secular. Everybody is represented in this government in some form or another in terms of the different groups that make up Israel. Of course, not the people who are voting against it and want it deposed, but in terms of the cross-section of Israeli society, it's represented in this government. And that makes it novel. That makes it a precious experiment, in my view. And its ability to survive is really an ability of this concept of national unity to survive, I believe.
Well, if we term it an experiment, I'm afraid that as I see things, and again, you're welcome to disagree with me or to correct me, it hasn't quite busted out of the lab and permeated the broader Israeli society and broader Israeli electorate. You still see these divisions, you still see this nationalism, you still see this extreme leftism, you see it all over the place. What do we do to show this experiment as a positive event in Israel's history and for Israel's future?
Well, I think that, changing the way that the discussion is held and legitimizing the ability of the Israeli people to hold disagreements, acknowledging the fact that each side of the major divide has Israel's best interests at heart, starting out with that assumption, and then, coming to the conclusion that, look, we both want what's best for the country, but we have radical different views on how to achieve that. If we don't get to those starting positions, then we will risk dangerous tears in society. And it's something that I think we need to sound the alarm on domestically. I don't think we have the luxury for those kinds of tears. They have harmed our past sovereign states in Jewish history tremendously. They've paralyzed the ability of the Jewish people to deal with external threats, in the past. All we need to do is look at how, the Second Temple fell and how the kingdom of Judea fell. And was conquered again and again because of Jewish people's tendency towards factionalism. So this is a deep problem. It's a historical problem. Unfortunately, it's in our DNA, and it requires a real overhaul and ability to overcome these instincts to assume the worst about political rivals. That would be a good first step.
So Yaakov, one of the things that I constantly hear, and again, I'm sure you hear it as well, is the notion that no matter what goes on in the political echelons, the defense establishment continues on its way, remains focused, remains working, functional, and able to deploy the best of its abilities in the face of any threats, foreign or domestic. I don't believe that. I think that if there is delinquency in the governing coalition, which there seems to be, then the defense establishment cannot receive clear orders, clear strategic aims, clear doctrine, clear operational instructions. And I'm worried about it. And one of the reasons that I'm worried about it, of course, is the issue of Iran. And so we see, Yaakov, that for the first time, the Israeli Air Force will practice for a wide-scale strike in Iran later this month during the military's major Chariots of Fire exercise. In light of growing uncertainty regarding a return by Iran to the 2015 nuclear deal amid long-stalled negotiations with the United States, the IDF in the past year has ramped up its efforts to prepare a credible military threat against Tehran's nuclear facilities. Now, as I read about this operation, I learned that the large-scale air maneuvers included a simulated attack on Iranian nuclear targets, and those maneuvers will take place, that's again the preparations, the practice, the drills, they will take place over the Mediterranean Sea during the fourth and final week of the month-long exercise that commences on May the 29th. The Chariots of Fire drill, which involves nearly all units of the IDF, I'll ask you more about that in a moment, Yaakov, has been focusing on training for fighting on Israel's northern borders, including against Iran-backed Hezbollah terror groups inside Lebanon. Now, my question to you is as follows. Is there a credible military threat against Iran? I say there is not. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, the most interesting answer to me to that question would first of all come out of Iran, because the notion of a credible military threat is all about how those who are threatened perceive the threat. Mm-hmm. And if they don't believe that there's a credible military threat, then there is no credible military threat, even if Israel intends to strike. The whole purpose of placing the threat on the table at this stage is in order to influence Iranian behavior in a way to avoid the need to strike. That is the purpose of this posturing. It is in order to reduce the need to ever have to give the order to fire a large-scale aerial attack on Iran's nuclear program. Unfortunately, where we are right now is in a kind of twilight zone. You mentioned the stalled attacks, the stalled negotiations. And you said that it's stuck. And that's exactly where we are. We're in a twilight zone where, on the one hand, there is no diplomatic progress currently taking place on Iran's nuclear program. And that could change, tomorrow, that could change next week, but it has been stuck for a while. And on the other hand, the Iranians are racing ahead, enriching uranium, building new ways to create fissile material, centrifuges that they're developing and that they're installing in underground facilities. And they are really making what I can only term as alarming progress on their ability to enrich uranium. And they are currently just a few weeks from having enough uranium for a first nuclear bomb. I really want to add a clarification here. That does not mean that they're a few weeks away from having a nuclear bomb, because in order to have a fully operational nuclear weapon, you have to do other things that the Iranians currently are not doing, such as learning how to put that warhead on a missile and miniaturizing it and holding an underground nuclear test. These are all things that the Iranians are currently very deliberately freezing. But this issue of enriching uranium and mastering that process, this is the most difficult part of a nuclear program. And the Iranians have unfortunately almost completely mastered it. So the fact is that they are making very rapid progress. And even if they intended this to initially be bargaining chips, the more progress they can make, the more they can squeeze the Americans and the international community into getting a better and better deal. But if the deal is stuck, they may at some point turn around and say to themselves, let's just go for nuclear breakout. We're so close already as it is, let's do it. And the closer they get, the more tempting they could be to make that decision. And that is why Israel is now put at the number one priority list in terms of the defense establishment, the ability to launch a long-range strike on Iran's nuclear program. There's nobody else who is serious about doing it. There's nobody else who has an interest in doing it right now. And Israel has recognized an alarming vacuum. So we're seeing, unprecedented preparations in terms of the ability to choose the right aerial platforms, to conduct the right intelligence gathering, to choose the right refueling routes, ammunition. This is all priority number one in the Israeli Air Force. And this exercise is a reflection of that. Of course, it's drilling what would happen also after a potential strike, which is a multi-arena conflict. We can get into some of those scenarios later if you like. But certainly there's no doubt in the Air Force's mind that this now needs to be the top priority, to have that ability ready and various forms of that ability ready to go as soon as possible.
And I really do appreciate the insight you brought about a credible threat being only as credible as the threat is perceived to be by the party who we seek to threaten. That's very, very interesting. My reasoning for believing that there is not a credible military threat, to take a different perception, is that I don't believe the political will exists. Mm-hmm. I believe that the state of Israel, the Israel Defense Forces, the Israel Defense Establishment can draw up all the plans in the world, but the political will to implement those plans is not in hand. It's not a failure exclusively of this government. It's a failure of previous governments as well. We've all read the reports of when Netanyahu and his then defense minister Ehud Barak wanted to launch the strike, and they were opposed. They were opposed by senior members of the Israeli defense establishment, and they stood back from their plans to do that. Do you think it's the political will, Yaakov, for a strike?
So I think that we should introduce a concept into this discussion that's called not in my watch, not under my watch. And I think the idea that any government would receive intelligence of a possible breakthrough, a nuclear breakthrough by Iran, that would happen under its watch would form an intolerable scenario for any government in power. And the reason I say that is because it's, to me at least, my belief is that when the defense chiefs hold that cabinet meeting on that fateful day, whenever it may come, and they talk about what the implications of a nuclear Iran would be, which is creating a nuclear umbrella over the entire Iranian Shiite axis. And we don't need to look further than Russia when we want to ask ourselves what a belligerent state would do when it feels that it has nuclear immunity. Okay, so we have a radical revisionist Islamist regime in Iran. It's very calculated, but once it gets its nuclear umbrella over not only itself, but over its entire proxy system that it has been building throughout the region, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shiite militias in Syria and in Iraq, the terror factions in the Gaza Strip. So all of these factions are now emboldened. They're more confident. They're going to be armed to the tooth with conventional surface-to-surface rocket fire, missile fire. And that reality in and of itself is intolerable. Now, if we add to that another aspect, which is the beginning of a regional nuclear arms race, the Sunni states in this region are as threatened by Iran as Israel is and its intentions, even if not as immediately. Of course, Israel is the top ideological enemy of Iran. Iran is serious when it talks about destroying the state of Israel in terms of how it wishes to do that. You know, it's less about throwing a nuclear weapon, and it's more about breaking the spirit of the Israeli people. That is what Iran is trying to do. But the Sunni states would also view a nuclear Iran as being intolerable. They're also threatened by this radical hegemonic aspiration of the Iranian regime. So they will naturally go and try and get their own nuclear weapons. And then what we would have is the world's least stable region, armed, throughout, proliferated by the world's most dangerous weapons. And that is a formula that I think any government, if it's presented with this formula and it's told, this is the time to stop that from happening. And it's not a permanent stop, by the way. I think we should also throw that into the equation. Even an attack is not a solution. It's a delaying mechanism. Everything that we're doing in terms of the nuclear program is a delaying mechanism. The reported covert operations, the diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, everything here is a delaying mechanism, because ultimately the only way to permanently solve this threat is to see the Iranian regime change its ideology. And until that happens, they're going to try and get nuclear weapons and use it for very, very dangerous and destabilizing motivations. So the bottom line to me is that I don't think any Israeli government, any Zionist Israeli government would look at that scenario and say, I'm going to let this happen under my watch. That is my personal belief.
Well, successive Israeli governments have had to say preemptively, and in the wake of the signing of the JCPOA, they have had to say Israel is not bound by the terms of the JCPOA in any sense. I don't believe that. I think that we are actually, if not bound, certainly handcuffed or restrained in terms of how much we can act in the event that the US returns to a JCPOA, maybe a revised JCPOA, we'll wait and see, with the Iranians. Do you think that my assessment's correct? Do you think that Israel can retain its ability to act in full as and when it feels it ought to parry off what you've just said about the Israeli government's unwillingness to accept the formula you just so clearly described?
Well, I think that, if we dissect your question, and it's a very good one, it's a very important question. If Israel feels the need to act after the JCPOA is revived, that would mean that the Iranian government and regime is actually violating the JCPOA. And if the Israeli intelligence community gets evidence of that violation, it can share it with its partners. Of course, we're talking about primarily the United States, but not only. And it can say, listen, there is a severe violation here, and we're going to act, and hopefully you'll join us, but if not, we're going to act. Now, I think that is actually the less problematic scenario. The more problematic scenario is that Iran complies with the JCPOA, does not violate it, because it knows that the sunset clauses are not far away. And then Israel will have no justification to act because it's complying with the JCPOA. Okay, so there'll be a period of quiet for a number of years. But by the end of this decade, this very decade, those sunset clauses will mean that Iran will be able to enrich as much uranium as it wants. It will be able to stockpile that uranium, and it will get full international legitimacy to not only become a nuclear breakout state, putting it very, very close to an actual nuclear weapon, but also the ability to, fund its war machine, both its own military and its proxies through international trade and the selling of oil, because they will have no sanctions placed on it. And that is why reviving the JCPOA is really a poor course of action as far as Israel is concerned, as far as the region is concerned. The sunset clauses and the amount of progress that Iran has already made, and since say 2018, all mean that even if Iran sticks to the deal and Israel has no justification to act, we will still be on some kind of collision course towards the end of the decade.
Okay, Yaakov, there's a development here from which one can derive confidence or trepidation, because in a signal to Iran, the US Air Force has said that it will refuel Israel Air Force fighter jets during a massive aerial drill in the coming weeks. That's a reference to the Chariots of Fire drill that will simulate an Israeli strike against Iran. The Israeli media informed the viewers on Tuesday night that US refueling tankers will drill the mid-air refueling of Israeli fighter jets during the Iran attack simulation. I referenced that earlier. The IAF, the Israeli Air Force, declined to comment, and surprisingly, Yaakov, what are the implications of the US readiness to refuel Israeli jets? Does this mean that that is the limit of US involvement in any strike against Iranian nuclear facilities? In other words, we're not going to see the United States deploy directly against the nuclear facilities over in Iran. And when I say directly, I mean primarily by way of the Air Force.
So the first thing I would note in regards to that is that the US has distanced itself from those reports very recently, just before we went on air. And they've said that those reports are not actually accurate, and that they are there as observers and nothing more. They're not playing an active role. So there is definite signaling here by the US saying, we are not actively practicing an attack on Iranian nuclear programs with the Israeli Air Force. But even their arrival as an observer for such an exercise is a signal. Everything, that the US does in this context is a signal. So I think that, there's a couple of conclusions that we can draw from here. First of all, there's a statement here about the closeness of the defense establishments of the two countries. Whatever the political ups and downs between the government of Israel and the American administrations, and they've known, their ups and downs, and that, better than almost anybody, the intricacies of these relationships. The defense establishments have been able to keep a stable level of cooperation, and it has only increased. Even at times of, real diplomatic crisis between Washington and Jerusalem, we have seen the Pentagon and the Israeli Defense Ministry, the US military, and the IDF, the general staff and senior command of the United States, maintain a solid, healthy, close relationship in which there's a lot of coordination, there's a lot of intelligence sharing, and there's a lot of planning on how to fight back against Iranian destabilizing efforts on a day-to-day basis. So I think that is very encouraging. And first of all, I would see this willingness by the US to act even as an observer, even if we accept that that's what's happening, as a sign, another sign of the closeness of the two defense establishments. And this closeness has only grown stronger since the US accepted Israel into the area of responsibility for Central Command. This is the US military command that is responsible for the entire Middle East. Now, the fact that Israel has moved from EUCOM to CENTCOM really means that Israel can speed up its plans to be part of a regional bloc of countries that is threatened by Iran, that wants to cooperate against Iran, moderate Sunni countries that look to Israel for assistance, for capability sharing, for intelligence sharing. All of these things, I think, are wrapped up in this closeness that Israel and the United States have in this region. So I think that is encouraging, that is important. However, none of it means that the US has obligated itself to assisting an Israeli attack. None of it means that the United States would facilitate or approve of such an attack. And I think that we should be very wary of drawing any conclusions about the willingness of the Biden administration or any American administration to be part of a future potential Israeli strike on Iran. We really just don't know how they would react to such a scenario. We don't know.
Well, Yaakov, this massive military drill that's been announced, and I'm again repeating its name, it is the Chariots of Fire drill, is aimed at readying Israeli troops for a major multi-front war against the state of Israel, presumably in the wake of an attack by Israel against Iran's nuclear facilities. How would you assess the readiness of the Israel Defense Forces to tackle these multiple fronts? And I'd like you to first speak about Lebanon. We have well over 100,000 projectiles of varying lethality pointed at the state of Israel from inside southern Lebanon. We face the prospect of those being fired with varying degrees of precision, ranging from an indiscriminate fire to a targeted fire against Israeli facilities at the rate of about 2,200 per day. The Iron Dome is not generally assessed to be fully effective against that type of bombardment at all. It's not just an assessment, it's a fact. How ready is the state of Israel to tackle the threat from Hezbollah if it is used for what I believe is its primary purpose, namely to retaliate against Israel in the face of a strike against Iran's nuclear facilities?
So, when we talk about military readiness, I think the first thing that we should say is let's be humble in our assessments, because if we look at, just as an example, and this is not directly linked to anything that's going on in this region, but Russia's confidence before invading Ukraine, and its total lack of intelligence gathering, risk assessment, and ability to think about beyond its own expectations of what would happen in Ukraine once those Russian columns started pouring in, is a reminder to all militaries around the world that wars can be surprising, that wars can be unpredictable. And if you don't prepare for the worst, if you don't have, plans B and C and D, then very often states and militaries will absorb extremely unpleasant surprises. And we've seen the unpredictability and the unpredictable nature of war happen everywhere throughout this region. The United States has experienced it as well in multiple locations in its own military history. So we have to be humble when we talk about readiness, especially when we're talking about this kind of asymmetric, intensive urban warfare that Hezbollah is preparing for the IDF. Having said all of that, my own belief, and based on what I can tell from what's happening in terms of the military's preparations, is that the IDF today is almost incomparably more capable in terms of its ability to take on these types of threats compared to, say, 20 years ago. And I'm also going to add to that statement that the enemy, Hezbollah particularly, which is the most powerful conventional threat that Israel faces, is also almost incomparably more powerful. Say, I would give it around 20 times more powerful today than it was 20 years ago. So both sides are upgrading their capabilities. This is not a one-way street. So both sides are way more advanced, capable, and able to deploy far more firepower than they were 20 years ago. I think for the IDF, we have to look at it in terms of two realms. First is the aerial assault. The aerial assault in any future full-scale conflict when it comes to Hezbollah, I think will be something that the region has never seen before. If we're talking about the number of airstrikes that would occur per 24 hours, and my understanding is that they're talking about thousands of airstrikes per 24 hours, something that the IAF has never done before. And each strike is using a precision-guided missile, precision-guided munition, and it's guided by intelligence that is, gathered through means that were not available 20 years ago, and using big data analysis and artificial intelligence to find the most valuable targets and the most strategically sensitive targets on the enemy. If you combine this marriage between air power and intelligence, and if Israel actually uses, the full force that it has been building up, which it has not done in any of its recent conflicts. And I think that's also important to point out. All of the past conflicts that we've seen in Gaza have been conflicts of deterrence, an attempt to stabilize and the situation, damage the enemy, not destroy the enemy. I think if Hezbollah begins flooding the Israeli home front with mass rocket and missile attacks, as you correctly note, attacks that the air defense system, as advanced as it is, and I believe it to be the most advanced in the world, multi-layered air defense system, it would be unable to cope, and citizens would face a level of shock that I think would be difficult for them today to imagine. If the country finds itself in that situation and it unleashes its full military power, beginning with this air assault that I'm describing, I think that Hezbollah will absorb an extremely painful blow. And the second part of this offensive is based on a ground offensive. And here things get a lot more tricky. Hezbollah are very good at urban warfare. They have gained extremely valuable experience during their time in Syria. In Syria, they really learned how to become an army. I think I've heard a lot of defense officials say that in Syria, Hezbollah stopped just being a terror organization. It is that, of course, but it also turned into a real army, because that's where it learned how to take ground and to use intelligence and direct artillery power and doing, the things that a classical army actually does. That's where it really learned how to do that. And it also learned from the Russians who it worked with in Syria. So, Hezbollah started talking about things like sending thousands of fighters into the Galilee. They dug tunnels in order to do that. And I think, one of the greatest achievements of the last chief of staff, Gadi Eisenkot, was to spearhead the exposure of those tunnels and their neutralization, because that would have been a shock, I think, that, would have reverberated for years to come had that capability, been left to stand. And then moving into enemy territory, using capabilities that, again, have not been seen in modern warfare on that scale. So I'm talking about, again, the ability to gather intelligence for the ground forces, share targets in real time, act as a digital military network that is able to distribute tasks and targets in real time on a network, and close, sensor to shooter cycles very, very quickly. And also, I think, if we're looking at Russia, the vulnerability of armored platforms and vehicles has proven to be an enormous vulnerability for the Russian offensive. And that is something that Israel is a world leader in, the ability to build active defenses on tanks and armored personnel carriers. And these systems, Rafael's trophy system, its ability to not only intercept an incoming anti-tank missile or an RPG, but also to immediately geolocate the position of the cell that fired and then share that target on the network. And then, anybody can strike in return fire, another tank or an aircraft. This kind of ability, I think, is new. It's promising. And I think that Israelis should at least feel assured in the fact that the defense establishment is not resting on its laurels. It's planning, a punch through enemy territory that I really believe has not been seen here in a very long time.
So I asked my question, Yaakov, based on the idea of what Hezbollah might do in the wake of Israel carrying out a military strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. Let's take the other side of that coin. Are we prevented from carrying out a nuclear strike against Israel, a strike against Iran's nuclear facilities, due to the massive deterring capabilities of Hezbollah?
Well, that's the Iranian game plan. Their whole plan of creating this, southern Lebanese command on our doorstep is to deter Israel from acting against the nuclear program. And it's really a kind of sort of, ping pong situation strategically, in terms of the goal of Hezbollah at this time is to deter Israel from striking Iran's nuclear program. Once Iran becomes a breakout nuclear state, then the purpose of Iran will be to deter Israel from attacking Hezbollah. And then you would get this sort of mutual deterrence situation that would make it more and more difficult for Israeli decision makers to give the order. And I think that is a situation and a mindset that Israel has to resist at all costs. If it recognizes a red line that has been crossed, it's just critical not to be deterred if that's a legitimate red line, and if the defense establishment is clear in its argument that the time to act has come. And Israel is a peace-loving country. Israel is a country that seeks to avoid war. And the purpose of the defense establishment is really to manage all of these, hugely complex threats without needing to deteriorate into war for as long as possible. So if defense and intelligence chiefs come and say, we cannot continue our logic of maintaining stability any longer, it is time to do something else, then I go back to my original belief. I think that any Zionist government in power will very likely approve that call to action, based on the idea that there's no choice, that we're back into a situation of being in a war of no choice. I think that is a clear-cut situation.
So Yaakov, talking about the approval of action, let's turn to the Gaza Strip. This past Independence Day, Yom HaAtzmaut, in the city of Elad, in the Israeli city of Elad, of course, 3 people were killed and several others very seriously wounded in a really horrific terror attack. The terrorists, 2 of them, attacked several people with an axe and with a knife. Hamas promptly, swiftly called the attack a heroic operation in response to Jewish Israelis visiting the Temple Mount. In a speech after the attack, the chief of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, threatened violent consequences in the event that Israel continues to allow Israeli Jews to visit the site. And he also urged Palestinians to strike Israelis with whatever they had, including axes. He said, quote, "Let everyone who has a rifle ready it. And if you don't have a rifle, ready your cleaver or an axe or a knife." These are the words of Yahya Sinwar, this individual who seems, in my assessment, to enjoy a certain degree of immunity over there in the Gaza Strip. Now, I've spoken, Yaakov, dozens of times to senior defense establishment figures, and those establishment figures who you know and with whom you regularly communicate, repeatedly reiterate this phrase of deterrence, okay? The notion of deterrence. They talk about the IDF needing to and ensuring the continuation of its deterrent capability against the enemy. But when I read words such as those that came from Sinwar, and these are by no means isolated phrases, and he means them, I become ever more convinced that this is no longer in hand. This deterrence is no longer in hand. And I say, not only have we lost the advantage of deterrence, but we in Israel have actually become deterred. Yaakov, isn't it time that we took back the advantage, beginning at the very least with the targeted killing of Sinwar? I mean, doesn't this individual just need to be eliminated? We've seen this done in the past with Yassin and then Rantisi successively. They were both eliminated by Israel. It keeps terror organizations firmly on the back foot. I'm not suggesting for a moment that cutting off the head of the snake would actually kill the rest of the body of terror there. That's not the case, but it would certainly push them on the back foot. It would certainly help us to gain an advantage, and it would certainly re-inject real deterrence into the equation. What are your thoughts?
So, of course, Israel can assassinate Yahya Sinwar through a targeted killing. There's no question that it can surprise him and do that. But of course, the very next moment, we will find ourselves in a war with the Gaza Strip. And we're talking about thousands of rockets on greater Tel Aviv. And there's going to be a major aerial campaign. Of course, we have to game out, any kind of drastic action. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to, in my view, cost benefit. So, as you absolutely correctly state, Yahya Sinwar is the head of the snake. He's not the snake. Perhaps, it is possible to argue very reasonably that this particular head is so problematic that it's worth taking the risk of a war in order to see him gone, and let's see who takes his place. But we also have to be aware that whoever takes his place could be even worse. We've had those situations in the past. And B, we have to ask ourselves, what do we want out of another war with Hamas? If we initiate this war, which we would do by conducting a targeted assassination, I think that we have to have a good answer to that question. Why do we want to go to war with Hamas at this time? Is it to topple them? to get rid of them as the rulers of Gaza, and that's something that's, would take months, and that would end up in a ground invasion. How far do we want this war to go? Or are we aiming to go back to deterrence again? So, okay, so, we assassinate him, there's going to be a war, and then each side de-escalates after a while, hopefully, if that's the goal, and then we're back at square one. So I think, again, we have to ask the big picture, strategic picture, big question, before any such step is taken. And if a good answer arrives, and if an answer can convincingly state that there is strategic long-term gain to be made from a targeted assassination and a war, then it's absolutely legitimate to consider that. If, on the other hand, once we game out these scenarios, we conclude, well, we're probably just going to end up back to where we are right now, then, there's good reason to argue, maybe we can wait with this, and it's not the first thing that we should do. So I think, whenever it comes to these kinds of decisions, we have to game out, we have to ask the big strategic questions, and we have to be sure that we know why we're doing what we're doing in terms of the big picture. Yahya Sinwar, in my view, is more sophisticated than he seems, because I agree with what you said about deterrence. He has proven last year that he will be the one who decides whether he is quote unquote deterred or not. So, just to flesh out what I'm saying, there was almost a consensus prior to the eruption of the last year's escalation that Hamas was deterred. And then, when Yahya Sinwar identified an opportunity to improve his political standing inside the Palestinian arena by presenting himself as the guardian of Jerusalem, and he saw an opportunity to fire, 5-6 rockets in Jerusalem's direction, and knowing full well that he would kickstart an escalation, he knew exactly, what he was doing. He proved to many people that he will be the one who decides when war will occur, conflict will occur, and when not. And that is a frustrating reality. That is something that causes a lot of frustration to many Israelis. And I completely relate to that frustration, that they always seem to be the one who initiate either stability and calm or conflict, and that Israel seems to be dragged along. I can completely connect to that frustration. But at the same time, I think that, we have to answer the big questions before we do things like a targeted assassination. And one of those questions is, I'll put it on the table for us and for all of our viewers and listeners. Do we recognize Hamas as the government of Gaza? Have we recognized this? Do we officially, recognize? Because if we do, we can say something like, well, this is actually a state to all intents and purposes. And if it's a state, and the next time we go to war with a state like that, then perhaps we can also, cut off the electricity supply. This is a hostile state. Why should electricity continue to flow? And we should stop opening, the border crossings to civilians of a hostile state. Because why would you do that for a state that's attacking you? But right now we're stuck in this sort of halfway house in which, we are saying, okay, well, we're going to look out for Gaza's civilians, and I completely connect with that desire to help innocent civilians, but we're not going to treat Gaza as this independent state. We're stuck in these sort of halfway definitions, and we've never actually answered some of the big questions about the Gaza Strip, what we want, how we recognize it. I think this is one of the reasons why we seem to get dragged along so often in these situations.
Well, Yaakov, I think that other than seeing proactive, preemptive, sustained operations of real consequence, I'm emphasizing of real consequence because I question the consequences of some of Israel's retaliatory strikes inside the Gaza Strip. Other than seeing these sustained operations, I'm going to reserve the position of as being the deterred party. I think that it's a very unpleasant thing for me to have to say. It's not something that I believe is within the ethos of the overwhelming majority of Israelis. But I think somehow, to use the phrase that you used at the top of this conversation, that idea has seeped into the decision-making atop the tree of the defense establishment somehow, for some reason. And I think it's very, very problematic. I'll also say, Yaakov, that I know that for years, everybody has said we must focus on the threat from Iran. Iran is what we must look at. Iran is what we must zone in on. Iran is what we must counter. And in contrast to that, we must manage the conflict with Hezbollah. We must manage the conflict with Gaza. And I don't agree with that at all. I think that what would be sensible would be to flip the equation, knowing that Iran poses the largest threat with the greatest implications, need to defang its proxies that are hard against Israel's borders now. Therefore, a preemptive operation of consequence against Hezbollah would be appropriate. A preemptive operation of consequence against the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad factions in the Gaza Strip would be appropriate, because we have a very simple equation that we must somehow balance and answer to. Do we want to have to deal with an all-out campaign against Hezbollah while it has lethal capabilities at its hands, but those capabilities are limited to conventional weapons? Or do we want to have to deal with Hezbollah and possibly Hamas when Iran has moved into nuclear weapons capabilities and perhaps has given those abilities in some form, some reduced form, to those proxies, and we now have to deal with nuclear-armed, nuclear-capable Iranian proxies hard against Israel's borders?
Well, you raise a very heavyweight and difficult dilemma, which, I wouldn't be surprised if it's, something that occupies the minds of cabinet members. It's an obvious question to ask, and it's an important question to ask, is what is Israel's red line? I think that is really another way of framing the same question. And I'm a big believer when it comes to red lines, into making them precise, not sharing them necessarily with the world. And I have no idea what Israel's internal red lines are in terms of what it's defined for Lebanon and Hezbollah. But we do know that generally it has a lot to do with precision guided missiles. If Hezbollah has a certain level of precision guided missiles, once it passes that red line, then the threat that it poses to the Israeli home front and the threat that it can pose to strategic sites like ports and airports and electrical and power stations and you name it, that becomes intolerable. And I think if we have defined red lines, then we can say when we reach a situation of a war of no choice and the need to preemptively attack. The 1967 Six-Day War is one dramatic example of that. The flooding of the Sinai Peninsula by Nasser's troops was a clear red line that Israel couldn't tolerate. And, we have other examples from the Bacon Doctrine. Once we have red lines that are agreed upon, that are defined, then I think we can say, okay, yes, we strive to go for stability. We strive to avoid war because of the enormous costs, human suffering that it causes to everybody, to Israelis, to the other side of the border, to civilians on both sides. Israel as a peace-seeking country does not want war. And I'm personally proud of that fact. I'm proud of the fact that the defense establishment here does everything it can to try and avoid war, because, the people that we lose in war, as you know so well, cannot come back. And therefore, this sanctity of human life as a value and the desire to preserve human lives is a holy value for, any life-seeking democratic state. And therefore, I believe that it is important to also grant legitimacy to attempts to prevent war. And that's why I bring in these red lines. I think that red lines are really clear strategic trigger points in which we say, look, the cost benefit here changes once these lines cross. The desire to prevent war no longer makes sense because the threat has become intolerable. And therefore, I always bring back these kinds of dilemmas, and they are dilemmas. I view them as dilemmas. If I was in the cabinet, I don't think there are any easy decisions. When human lives are at stake and so much is at stake and you're the decision maker, I think it's a very unenvious position to be in, to know that so much hangs on your decision, on life or death, peace or war. Very, very difficult decisions. So I bring it back to red lines, and I bring it back to the concept of wars of no choice, conflicts of no choice. and always keeping in touch with the larger strategic interest. I'll just add one more thing. I believe that ultimately, as former Defense Minister Bughi Ya'alon has stated, ultimately, Israel is still fighting its war of independence. And even though today it has become militarily stronger than its enemies, and it is militarily stronger than all of its enemies combined, I believe, even to this day, we have to also keep the long game in mind. Really what we're trying to do, I think, in the long term is to make it clear that this ideology, this Islamist ideology, which believes that it is possible to destroy the state of Israel, we're trying to make this idea lose its credibility. And I think that will take time. It's a multi-generational effort. I don't believe that there's anything that we can do in terms of from today to tomorrow that will make these dangerous Islamist jihadist ideas disappear. And yes, that means that we have to manage them. And yes, that means that we have to do risk assessments and cost benefit analysis all of the time. And when it's necessary, yes, to go out and attack as well.
Well, Yaakov, I appreciate what you've said about the cost of war, which of course I know well, and it still informs my positions on these matters to this day. Mm-hmm. I will just say that with the cost of war always having to be at the forefront of policymakers' decision-making processes, we also must not forget that the purpose of the military is to defend the citizenry, not the other way around. And I think that at times we do see an inversion of that dynamic within Israel. However, it's a bit more complex because obviously it's a conscript military. They are our citizens who are our soldiers and vice versa.
Right.
But I just wanted to underscore that. The last question that I have for you today, Yaakov, and I'll ask you to be brief, although it's a complex question, speaks to domestic terrorism and the domestic challenges, especially in the context of upcoming conflicts, but not exclusively. Look, the IDF, Yaakov, is preparing for twice the amount of violence within Israeli Arab cities than during last year's anti-Hamas operation in the Gaza Strip, in the event of a new conflict. During the 11-day fighting of last year, we all remember the heavy rioting in various areas, as well as mixed Israeli Arab cities such as Lod and Yafo. 2 people were killed and several civilians were injured. As part of the ongoing IDF drill, the military is going to simulate scenarios where there is even heavier rioting at twice the level of the violence seen last year. Israel has been carrying out an operation to that end, which is called the Breaking of the Wave operation over the course of the last 2 months. And it's all an attempt to prevent further attacks against Israeli citizens after a spate of attacks has claimed the lives of 19 Israelis. Now, during a visit to the Ephraim Brigade in the West Bank, Yaakov, on Tuesday morning, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett said that the IDF has a clear directive to root out terrorists. Yaakov, tell us a little bit about some of the ongoing violence and tell us how much of a liability that threat from within Israel's borders might actually be in the event of a future conflict.
Well, we certainly received a wake-up call last year, during Guardians of the Wall, Operation Guardians of the Wall. We saw unprecedented scenes of swaths of Arab Israeli areas basically break out into disturbances, the scope of which we have not seen before in this country, at least in decades. So that was a wake-up call. And that is something that basically stopped this kind of threat from being imaginary and made it very easy for everybody to imagine what would happen in a future war. This could happen again. So I think the first thing we have to say is, the majority of the Arab Israeli citizens were not involved in that kind of violence. We're not interested in being involved in that kind of violence, and felt threatened by the repercussions of that violence. So I think it is important to put that on the table and to make sure that we're not generalizing. But that doesn't eliminate the problem. The problem is very serious. If the military will be involved in a multi-arena conflict, the police will be involved with, projectile fire that's landing all over the home front. The eruption of some sort of domestic intifada would present an enormous threat to security, and it's one that cannot be understated. And as a result of that, I think that, we've also seen some very, very interesting decisions from the government recently to form a national guard. I mean, I think that that is going to really help the police if it's set up fast enough to inject the kind of manpower that's needed to free up the other security forces to do what they need to do. Now, in terms of this current terror wave, it's actually quite unique because what started it was Arab Israeli citizens who were radicalized by jihadist ideology from ISIS. If you remember the attack in Beersheba, and there was an attack afterwards that was inspired by that. And what we have is the beginning of this wave. It comes from Arab Israelis who then inspired Palestinians from the northern West Bank, from the Jenin area, to do the same and to use gaps in the security fence to infiltrate Israel and to conduct horrific crimes against civilians. So it's a unique terror wave because, on the one hand, Hamas is inciting, it's injecting all of the background gasoline into the air that, only a few sparks are needed to set, the region alight. But then on the other hand, all of the people who have conducted these attacks do not come from a formal terrorist organization. They did not receive orders. And this is exactly what you were referring to when you quoted Yehia Sinwar in his speech. He saw how effective this is. Get the idea into the terrorist mind. Hey, you don't need us to act. Keep this to yourselves. And that way you don't leave an intelligence trail for the Shin Bet to pick up in time to prevent these kinds of attacks. So it's a real challenge. It is something that requires a multi-pronged effort by the IDF launching, nightly counter-terrorist raids, particularly in the Jenin area. The Israel police has stepped up its raids within the Green Line. There's a national guard that's being, formed. And I think we are seeing the security system learn lessons and improve. This is a new kind of a threat, and it's going to be with us, unfortunately, for quite a while. I don't think it's going to disappear so quickly.
Well, Yaakov, I just want to tell you that you have, as always, brought a valuable perspective to our conversation. I always learn from you whenever we sit and talk, whether it's here virtually or in person over there in
thank you very much.
And thank you very, very much indeed.
Likewise, by the way.
Thank you. And I just want to tell everybody, our listeners, that we've got some exciting news. We are launching this Friday, so tomorrow, we are launching the Israel Defense and Diplomacy Forum podcast, or IDDF podcast, as we like to call it. And that features Chuck Freilich from the Israeli center left in conversation with Danny Ayalon from the Israeli center right. And they're going to be discussing hot button issues. Chuck Freilich is a former deputy national security advisor to the state of Israel in the state of Israel. And Danny Ayalon, of course, was the former Israeli ambassador to the United States of America. Yaakov, we are called the MirYam Institute, partly because of the great stature of MirYam in Jewish liturgy, but also because if you take the letters that spell out the word MirYam, it's Mem Resh Yud Mem, which also spells the word Merim, to elevate. And we want to elevate the level of discourse and conversation here at the MirYam Institute as it pertains to the state of Israel. So I just wanted everybody to know that the IDDF podcast will be launching tomorrow on Friday. They can subscribe to it anywhere that they subscribe to their podcasts from. And it's going to feature Chuck and Danny in conversation. I want to ask you as a colleague, a friend, a team member, what do you think about the importance of having left and right voices on important, vital, strategic discussions and subject matters, jousting and politely agreeing, disagreeing, but always doing so with a view to ensuring a secure future for the state and the people of Israel?
I think it's exactly the kind of discussion and approach that our country so badly needs. It's exactly this kind of ability to hold this discussion, to talk about the policies without assuming the worst about another, but on the contrary, assuming the best and being aware that each side is patriotic, does love the state, and simply does not agree necessarily on what needs to be done, but to hold a discussion and to hear the other side and to engage. The fact that you are facilitating this, I think, is an enormous service to the Jewish people. And I hope that it serves as an example for everybody who is exposed to this enlightened level of discussion, that this is the way it's done. This is the way policy needs to be discussed. This is the way disagreements need to be handled if we are going to maintain our resilience and deal with all of these external threats that are at our doorstep. I think you're leading the way on how to do that.
Thank you, Yaakov. As ever, I reiterate my thanks to you. Please, everybody, subscribe to the IDDF podcast. It's the Israel Defense and Diplomacy Forum podcast. And Yaakov, I wish you and your dear family a Shabbat Shalom and
Shabbat Shalom.
A peaceful weekend. And I thank all of our listeners. And of course, I reiterate my profound appreciation to Rosita Panini, co-founder of the MirYam Institute, and to our colleague in common, Alan Langer. Thank you for bringing this about. It's been a wonderful discussion, Yaakov. Always appreciated, and I look forward to having you back. Over and out.
Thank you very much.
Take care.